The lonely retreat. David had spent most of his life among the stars, serving the Terran fleet. As one of its most skilled pilots, he had fought battles in distant systems, negotiated with alien species, and stared into the vast, endless void more times than he could count. But now, after 35 long years of service, he had finally left it all behind. The roar of engines, the weight of responsibility, the politics between worlds, all of it was over, or at least that was what he believed when he stepped down from his post and bought a small cabin on a quiet moon called Eridan 3. The place was everything he thought he wanted. It was remote, surrounded by towering silver pines and endless stretches of soft blue grass. The sky was painted with 2 suns during the day and 3 moons at night. There was no traffic, no constant alerts from command, no endless noise of soldiers running drills, only the wind whispering between the trees and the soft hum of the small generator behind his cabin. It was the perfect escape from everything he had endured in his years of service. David spent his mornings watching the mist roll off the nearby lake with a cup of strong Terran coffee in his hand, his afternoons repairing small tools or tending to his hydroponic garden, and his evenings reading old history books under the soft glow of a lantern. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and sometimes he found himself wondering if this was what he truly wanted. But whenever the memories of battle tried to creep in, he reminded himself that this quiet life was what he had earned. It was during one of those quiet evenings when everything changed. He had just finished adjusting the solar panels behind the cabin when he heard a soft tapping sound coming from the front door. At first he thought it was just the wind pushing loose branches against the walls, but then the knock came again, steady and deliberate. 3 short taps followed by silence. David frowned. No one ever came this far into the forested region of Eridan 3. His cabin was isolated by design. Even the local surveyors and traders avoided this area because of how far it was from the central settlement. Still, the knock came again, louder. This time he walked to the door, slowly, his hand brushing against the old plasma pistol mounted on the wall. He told himself it was probably nothing, maybe some lost travelers, maybe a delivery error. But deep down a strange feeling crawled through him when he opened the door. His breath caught in his throat. Standing on his doorstep were 3 alien women, tall, graceful, and entirely unlike any species he had ever encountered in his long years with the fleet. Their skin shimmered faintly like moonlit water, with soft patterns that shifted slowly as they moved. Their eyes were wide and luminous, like polished crystals glowing faintly with a pale silver light. Their clothes were delicate, almost ceremonial, woven from strands that glimmered faintly like living silk, and yet there was something sorrowful in their expressions, something that carried the weight of loss. The one standing in the middle stepped forward and spoke, her voice soft and melodic, but carrying an unshakable firmness. "Pilot David," she said. "You promised." David stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. "I think you have the wrong person," he said slowly. "I don't know you, and I certainly haven't made any promises." The alien tilted her head, as if confused, then her expression hardened. "No," she said, "you saved Velara Prime. You saved our homes, our families, our lives, and by doing so, you bound yourself to us." Name Velara Prime stirred an old memory David hadn't thought about in years. Near the end of his career, he'd led a desperate evacuation during a solar flare event that threatened to wipe out an entire colony on the edge of known space. The mission had been chaotic and brutal, hundreds of ships trying to escape a dying star, and he'd made a split-second decision to divert power from his own cruiser shields to stabilize the last transport carrying civilian families. They had made it out just in time, but he had never known what became of them until now. Before he could ask more questions, the alien woman stepped aside and gestured to the shadows behind her, and David's stomach sank when he saw them, more figures emerging from between the silver pines. 4, 5, 6, until eventually 11 alien women stood in the fading sunlight, all wearing similar ceremonial robes, all with the same sorrowful but determined expressions. David rubbed a hand across his face. "This has to be some kind of mistake," he said, his voice low. "I retired. I came here to be left alone." One of the aliens, a younger-looking one with emerald patterns along her arms, spoke softly. "That is why we came here, to honor your solitude. We would never disturb you unless the call of our customs left us know." Choice. David leaned against the doorframe, trying to piece together what they were saying. The leader explained that according to Velaran traditions, any warrior or civilian saved from certain death during a catastrophe owed a spiritual bond to their rescuer. If those saved had loved ones who perished, the bond extended to them as well. In this case, the 11 women were all widows of Velaran pilots who had died during the solar flare. Their mates had been lost, their families broken, but because David had saved the last transport and ensured their survival, he was now considered spiritually tied to them. Wanted to laugh at how absurd it sounded, but the earnestness in their luminous eyes stopped him. This wasn't some scam or misunderstanding to them. This was law, ancient and sacred, one that governed their people for generations. Still, he couldn't just let 11 alien widows move into his secluded cabin. His entire reason for coming to Eridan 3 was to avoid complications, to avoid politics, to avoid people. But even as he opened his mouth to refuse, he hesitated. Something in their faces made it impossible to simply turn them away. They were desperate, not weak exactly, but carrying the heavy weight of expectations and grief. David sighed heavily. "Look, this place is small," he said finally. "I came here to be alone, not to start some kind of interstellar household. You can't just show up expecting me to fix everything." The leader lowered her gaze, her shifting patterns dimming slightly. "We know you seek solitude," she whispered, "but if you reject us entirely, you risk something far greater than inconvenience. There are factions among our people who would see us punished for coming to you. If we return empty-handed, it could start something terrible." David felt the air grow heavier. Around him, 11 alien widows standing on his doorstep, bound to him by a custom he barely understood, and yet somehow at the center of a situation he never asked for, he thought had left these kinds of complications behind. But the galaxy, it seemed, wasn't done with him. Yet night began to fall, casting deep shadows across the clearing. His cabin lights flickered on one by one, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, David stepped back from the door and gestured reluctantly inside. "All right," he said quietly. "Come in." One by one, the alien women crossed the threshold, moving with an almost liquid grace, their faint glowing patterns casting strange reflections against the wooden walls. David watched them silently, his mind spinning faster than any engine had ever flown. He had wanted solitude, but instead, it seemed he had inherited 11 living reminders of the galaxy he had tried so hard to leave behind. Though he didn't realize it yet, this was only the beginning. The first visitors. David woke up earlier than usual the next morning. Though he had barely slept at all the night before, the quiet comfort of his cabin had changed overnight, replaced by a strange new energy. He could hear soft movements coming from the other room. The alien widows had stayed silent through most of the night, settling themselves in the small space he had reluctantly offered them. He had given them blankets and made room near the heating unit, but his cabin was built for one person, not 12 even, so they moved carefully as though trying not to disturb him. Their presence carried a kind of weight that could not be ignored. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his face, trying to clear his thoughts. The scent of something faintly sweet drifted through the air. When he stepped into the main room, he found 3 of the widows kneeling on the floor, arranging strange crystalline bowls filled with shimmering blue liquid that pulsed faintly as if alive. They moved with quiet precision, their long fingers brushing against the surface of the liquid while murmuring words in a soft rhythmic language David couldn't understand. Leader of the group, who had introduced herself the night before. As Lyra turned when she sensed him watching, she inclined her head slightly, her luminous eyes reflecting the early sunlight. "You rest?" "Well," she asked, her voice calm but steady. David sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "I wouldn't call it resting exactly," he muttered, then frowned as he gestured at the bowls. "What is all this?" Lyra glanced at the other widows before replying. "These are memory vessels," she said. "Each one holds a fragment of the lives of our fallen mates. By bringing them here, We honor what was lost, and we honor you for what you saved. David stared at the glowing bowls for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. He had never been comfortable with ritual or ceremony, and now his small cabin was filling with artifacts of a culture he barely understood. He rubbed the back of his neck and muttered under his breath, "I just wanted a quiet retirement." The younger widow he had noticed before, the one with emerald patterns along her arms, stood and stepped closer. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, but carried a kind of stubbornness. "We understand what you wish," she said, "but you must understand what we carry. Our people believe that the ones who save us carry part of our souls too. Without acknowledging that bond, we cannot heal." David opened his mouth to protest, but stopped when he saw the expression in her luminous eyes. She wasn't pleading or begging. She was simply explaining, as though this truth was as natural as breathing. He sighed heavily and sank into the old wooden chair at his table, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I saved a lot of people during my time with the fleet," he said finally, "but no one ever showed up at my door years later saying I owed them anything." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "Your species has no binding customs," she said, "but ours does. Without this ritual, our families would fall into dishonor. The survival of our clans depends on balance." David shook his head, quietly trying to make sense of it all. Part of him wanted to send them away, to lock the door and forget this ever happened, but another part of him knew it wasn't that simple. He had seen enough cultures and enough wars to understand one thing: traditions like this were rarely optional, especially when they involved entire factions of people. He stood finally and poured himself a cup of strong coffee, the bitter scent grounding him. He glanced at Lyra over the rim of the mug. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Do you expect to stay here forever?" Lyra exchanged a glance with the others before answering. "We do not wish to disrupt your solitude," she said carefully, "but until the bond is acknowledged, we cannot leave. Without your acceptance, our clans would not allow it." David set the mug down with a soft thud and rubbed his forehead. "So you're saying if I refuse this, some kind of political mess starts?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "If we return unbound, there are factions that will see us as disgraced. Some would demand punishment, others would use it as a reason to challenge the peace between our worlds." He muttered something under his breath about how retirement had been supposed to be simple, but deep down he already knew what this meant. The Terran Council wouldn't let something like this spiral. If the Velaran clan started fighting over this bond, there would be trade disruptions, military interventions, maybe even another border war. David had seen it happen too many times before. The galaxy had grown quieter in his later years, but all it ever took was one misunderstanding to set entire systems ablaze. Later that afternoon, David went outside to clear his thoughts. The twin sons of Eridan, 3, were high in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest. The widows followed at a distance, watching him silently as he walked toward the lake. He could feel their gazes on his back, heavy, but not hostile, more like they were waiting for him to make a choice. He crouched by the water and skinned his hand across the surface, watching ripples break against the reflection of the sky. He thought about the years he had spent fighting to protect people had never met. He thought about the sacrifices had made and the cost had paid in pieces of himself, and now when all he wanted was peace, the past had come to claim him anyway. As the suns began to sink lower, the sound of soft footsteps approached behind him. Lyra stopped a few steps away, her voice quiet but steady. "David, you saved us," she said. "You may not have wanted this bond, but without you, we would not be here. Everything we had would have been lost." He turned his head slightly, looking at her from the corner of his eye, and for the first time noticed something beneath the calm surface of her expression. A deep, unspoken grief. David didn't reply right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them. The sound of the wind through the silver pines and the gentle lapping of water against the shore filled the air. "Finally," he said softly, "I never asked to be anyone's savior." Lyra nodded slowly. "Neither did we ask to be widows," she said, "but here we are, and now we must carry what fate has given us." By The time they returned to the cabin, dusk was settling over the clearing, soft light spilling through the trees. When they stepped inside, David noticed that the other widows had arranged his small living space into something almost unrecognizable. Woven tapestries of their kind now hung along the walls. Strange crystalline symbols decorated the shelves, and the faint glow from the memory vessels cast shifting patterns across the room. It felt less like his private retreat and more like a place between two worlds. David wanted to protest but stopped himself when he saw how carefully they had placed each object. Nothing was done carelessly, everything had meaning. This wasn't just about them forcing their way into his life. It was about them bringing their past, their grief, and their traditions with them. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, David realized something unsettling. This wasn't going to resolve itself quickly. He was bound up in something far larger than his own wishes, and whether he liked it or not, the 11 alien widows were now part of his life, and the fragile peace between their people might depend on what he did next. And somewhere deep in the quiet part of his mind, he began to wonder if his solitude had truly been lost forever, or if perhaps his story was only just beginning. The cultural clash. David woke before dawn, his body restless, as though it remembered the tension of battle. Even though his mind begged for peace, he sat by the small window watching the faint blue light of the twin suns creep over the horizon. The alien widows were already awake, their movements silent as shadows as they prepared something that smelled faintly of crushed flowers and heated stone. They seemed tireless, as if sleep was only a suggestion for their kind. When David stepped into the main room, he found them gathered around the memory vessels again, their delicate hands hovering over the glowing liquids, whispering words in soft, unbroken tones. It was mesmerizing and unsettling at the same time. When Lyra noticed him, she inclined her head slightly. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm, but her luminous eyes held a weight that made David uneasy. He nodded absently and poured himself a cup of bitter coffee. As he sat at the table, he finally said what had been running through his head all night. "This can't go on forever. Lyra, we need to talk about what comes next. You can't all stay here. My cabin isn't built for this." Lyra held his gaze for a long moment before she spoke. "The bond must be acknowledged," she said carefully. "Until that is done, we cannot leave." David frowned. "I told you before, I don't understand this whole bond thing. Explain it to me like I am 5. Lyra paused, considering her words. "In our culture," she said slowly, "when someone saves another from certain death, a part of their spirit becomes tied to the rescuer. If those who were saved lose their mates, that bond transfers to the widows, and it becomes unbreakable until honored." David shook his head, running a hand down his face. "And what does honoring it mean exactly?" Lyra hesitated again, then answered, "There are many ways, but for us it means unity. We do not ask for control or dominance, we ask for guidance and acknowledgement. You are seen among us as the protector of our fallen. We need that tie to remain unbroken. Without it, factions among our people will see us as disgraced. They will demand vengeance or punishment." David leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, and muttered under his breath, "Great, so if I refuse, I start an interstellar incident." Lyra said nothing, but the silence was answer enough. Later that day, David tried to focus on his small repairs outside, but he could feel the weight of 11 pairs of luminous eyes watching him. Some of the widows stood quietly in the clearing, while others walked along the tree line, studying the strange plants of Eridan 3. They moved like ghosts, silent, graceful, yet carrying something heavy inside them. He caught himself wondering what lives they had left behind on Velara. Prime husbands, families, friends, entire communities, erased by the solar flare they had survived. But survival carried its own burdens. By midday, a sharp beeping from his old communications terminal pulled him back inside. The signal was encrypted, military level. He hesitated before opening it, knowing it could only mean trouble. When the message finally appeared, his stomach dropped. It was from the Terran Council. "Pilot David Arlen, you are hereby requested to attend a preliminary hearing regarding your interactions with representatives of Velara. Prime reports indicate possible violations of interspecies customs and treaties. Failure to comply could escalate tensions between Velaran clans and Terran authorities. Respond immediately. David cursed softly under his breath. He had spent years avoiding politics, yet somehow they had found him anyway. The council didn't summon people like him unless the situation was already serious. He looked up to find Lyra watching him silently, her gaze unflinching. "They know you are here," he said, holding up the message. Lyra nodded slowly. "They would." She replied, "Our arrival was not hidden. Many of our people follow the old ways. Others do not. If those others see our presence as dishonor, they will move against us." David stared at her for a moment, trying to decide whether he was angry, frustrated, or just tired. He had come here to escape war, but now war was creeping to his doorstep. That evening the widows prepared a meal unlike anything David had tasted before, fragrant and layered with strange flavors, but his appetite was gone. His thoughts tangled with the council's message and what it implied as they sat around the small table. Lyra spoke softly. "We will stand with you," she said. "We did not come to harm you or your people. We only seek recognition of what you did." David met her luminous eyes and saw no deception, there only quiet conviction. Younger widow with emerald patterns on her arms leaned forward. She had spoken little until now, but her voice was steady. "If you abandon us," she said, "there will be blood. Our clans will see us as traitors. They will send hunters to reclaim us, and the council will be drawn into it, whether you wish it or not." David clenched his jaw, his old instincts flaring. He had seen what happened when political tensions spiraled out of control. Entire worlds burned while leaders argued over technicalities. He had sworn never to be part of that again, and yet here he was. That night sleep eluded him. He lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the generator and the soft breathing of the widows in the next room. His mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. If he sided with the widows, he risked dragging the Terran Council into alien politics. If he refused, he could trigger a Velaran civil war. And either way, his quiet life on Eridan 3 was over. Near midnight, he stepped outside. The cool air settling on his skin. The twin moons hung low, casting silver light across the clearing. He stood there for a long time, staring at the endless forest, until he heard footsteps behind him. Lyra stopped beside him, silent for a while, before she spoke softly. "When our mates died, we thought we would follow them," she said, "but your actions gave us life. We are not here to take from you, David. We are here because our survival depends on what you represent." David turned to face her, searching for words, but found none. Instead, he simply nodded, though his expression was tight. He understood now. This was bigger than him, bigger than his solitude or his cabin. The galaxy had placed a choice in his hands, and one wrong move could ignite something no one could control. By the time dawn broke, David had made a decision. He didn't know if it was the right one, but he knew he couldn't ignore the council's summons. He would have to face them, explain everything, and hope reason prevailed. When he told Lyra, she simply bowed her head. "We will stand with you," she said. But as David prepared his old shuttle for the journey to the nearest Terran outpost, he noticed movement on the edge of the clearing, strange shapes shifting among the trees, watching from the shadows. His instincts sharpened instantly, years of combat training flaring awake. Whoever they were, they moved too carefully to be wildlife. David tightened his grip on the old plasma pistol strapped to his belt, and his voice was low when he said to Lyra, "We have company." And in that moment, he realized his problems were about to become much worse. The rising storm, the morning air was still and heavy. As David stepped outside his cabin, the forest around Eridan 3 was quiet, but it was the kind of silence that carried weight, a silence that warned of danger. Rather than peace, the strange shapes he had seen the night before were still out there, hidden among the silver pines, watching, waiting. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his hand resting lightly on the old plasma pistol strapped to his belt. The widows had gathered behind him, silent but alert, their luminous eyes scanning the tree line. David could sense their unease even though they said nothing. Lyra stepped closer, her voice low and calm but edged with tension. "They are here," she said, her Gaze fixed on the shadows, they followed us. David frowned. You mean from Valara Prime? She nodded. Once not all of our people agree with what we have done, she said softly. Some believe our bond to you dishonors the memory of our mates. Others see this as an opportunity to claim influence. If they take us back by force, they will rise in power among the clans. David cursed under his breath. This was exactly the kind of mess he had spent his entire life trying to avoid, yet here it was on his doorstep. The widows carried traditions he barely understood, but to someone out there, those traditions were worth fighting over, and maybe even killing for. Without warning, the silence shattered. A sharp pulse of energy burst through the air, striking a tree. At the edge of the clearing, it exploded into fragments, glowing embers scattering into the soft blue grass. David ducked behind the wooden railing, pulling Lyra down with him as the widows moved quickly with practiced precision, their robes whispering. As they spread out into defensive positions, despite their ceremonial appearance, they moved like trained scouts, graceful and deadly. From the shadows, at least 6 figures stepped into view, tall, armored Velerans, with dark obsidian plating that shimmered faintly in the light. Each carried a curved weapon, humming with energy symbols carved along their armor, marked them as members of a rival clan. One of them stepped forward, his voice cold and sharp. You do not belong here, he said, addressing the widows. You shame your clans and our ancestors by standing beside this human. Come with us now, or be taken. Lyra stepped out from behind the railing. Her luminous eyes, unyielding, her voice carried the weight of command. We chose this path, she said firmly. The bond is sacred and cannot be broken. The Veleran leader tilted his head slowly, then his gaze shifted to David. His crystalline eyes narrowed. And you human, you dare claim what is not yours? David straightened his shoulders, but kept his voice calm. I never asked for any of this, he said, but I won't let anyone take them by force. The Veleran leader made a soft clicking sound deep in his throat, and the air grew tense. The other armored figures raised their weapons, and David felt the rush of old instincts waking inside him, the part of him that had spent decades fighting battles across half the galaxy, never truly slept before he could give an order. 2 of the widows leapt forward, their movements a blur, their hands tracing quick patterns in the air. Glowing threads of energy materialized, forming translucent shields that absorbed the first volley of plasma fire. David dropped behind cover, his pistol humming to life as he checked its charge. It had been years since he'd used it, but muscle memory carried him through. Lyra called out something sharp and melodic in her own language, and the other widows responded, instantly spreading out with perfect coordination. They weren't soldiers exactly, but they were far from helpless. Each one carried small crystalline blades, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with power. They fought with a kind of rhythm David had never seen before, flowing around each other seamlessly as though sharing a single mind. The first wave of attackers closed in, and David fired precise shots, dropping 2 of them with clean hits. His breath came steady, his body moving automatically as though the decades of combat training had returned all at once. The clearing was alive with bursts of light and shouts in alien tongues. The blue grass caught fire in small patches, glowing faintly under the strange twin suns. One of the attackers lunged past David, aiming for Lyra, but she sidestepped with inhuman speed, her blade flashing. Once in a single elegant motion, the armored Veleran collapsed to the ground without a sound. David stared for half a second before forcing himself back into focus. There was no room for hesitation, not now. As the battle dragged on, David realized the rival clan hadn't come just to reclaim the widows. They wanted him too. If they could take him prisoner, they could dismantle the bond entirely and reshape the political balance on Valara Prime. This wasn't just about custom anymore. This was power. Then he heard it, a sharp rising whine from the tree line. His instincts screamed at him to move. He dove to the side, just as an energy cannon discharged, obliterating the spot where he'd been standing seconds before the blast tore through the side of his cabin, sending fragments of wood and metal scattering through the clearing. David gritted his teeth, forcing himself up. The attackers were regrouping, preparing for another push. and his cabin was no longer defensible. They needed to move. He shouted at Lyra and the others to fall back toward the ridge overlooking the lake. The widows moved as one, covering each other as they retreated. David fired at anything that moved, trying to buy them time. They reached the ridge just as a second volley of plasma fire rained down behind them. David crouched behind a cluster of stone outcrops, his heart pounding. "This isn't going to stop," he muttered. "They'll just keep coming." Lyra crouched beside him, her voice calm but heavy with determination. "We cannot let them take us back," she said. "If they succeed, the clans will turn on each other, and your council will intervene." David looked at her for a long moment, realizing the truth of her words. If this escalated into full conflict between Velerans and humans, the fragile peace he had helped build during his years of service would shatter in an instant. Attackers regrouped below, preparing for another assault. David checked his pistol. It was running low on charge. He glanced at Lyra, then at the others, and an old part of himself, the part that had led squadrons into impossible missions, came roaring back. "We hold here," he said, voice sharp and steady. "We make them regret ever stepping foot on this moon." When the next wave came, it was faster and heavier than before. But David and the widows fought with everything they had. Plasma fire cut through the air, glowing shields deflected incoming blasts, and blades flashed like streaks of lightning. David felt exhaustion creeping into his muscles, but he pushed it aside, relying on instinct and experience to guide his movements. Finally, after what felt like hours, the attackers faltered. 3 of them lay unconscious. 2 more retreated into the trees. The leader hissed something in his own language before pulling back with the rest of his forces, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they had come. David collapsed against the stone, breathing hard, his shirt damp with sweat. The widows gathered around him, their glowing patterns dim but steady. They had survived for now. But he knew this was far from over. Lyra looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "This was only the beginning," she said softly. David stared at the tree line where the attackers had vanished and nodded silently. Deep down, he knew she was right. The storm had only just begun. The final decision. Night after the battle was heavy with silence. The broken remains of David's cabin stood behind him, while the blue grass around the clearing was scorched and burned in strange glowing patterns. Smoke still drifted faintly from shattered wood and torn earth. David sat on a large stone near the edge of the ridge, his plasma pistol resting on his knee, his breath steady, but his body aching from exhaustion. 11 alien widows sat together nearby, some tending to their wounds, while others cleaned their blades. Their luminous eyes reflected the pale glow of the twin moons. Above, Lyra stood slightly apart from the rest, her expression unreadable, her patterns dimmed by fatigue, yet her stance remained strong. David stared at the wreckage of his once quiet retreat and let out a long breath. He had come to Eridan 3, seeking solitude, hoping to leave the weight of the galaxy behind. But now the galaxy had come knocking on his door with weapons and blood and choices he never wanted to make. He rubbed a hand across his face, trying to gather his thoughts, when Lyra approached quietly, standing beside him without speaking. After a moment, she finally said, "They will return." David looked up at her. Her voice was soft but steady. "This was only a warning," she continued. "If they truly wish to take us, they will come back with more warriors, more ships, and greater force." He nodded slowly. "I know," he said, then glanced back at the ruins of his cabin. "But I'm not letting them drag you away without a fight." Lyra studied him for a long moment before saying, "You have already given more than we could ever ask, and yet the choice ahead is not only about us." David frowned. "What do you mean?" She lowered her gaze. "Our people are divided," she said. "Some believe the bond must stand, others believe it must be broken, and the rival clans will use your refusal as an excuse to ignite war between us. And if that happens, the Terran Council will intervene." He finished her thoughts slowly and carefully. "Which means this quiet little moon will turn into the front line of another conflict." Lyra nodded, her patterns faintly pulsing with sorrow. "We cannot let that happen." David stood then, his decision forming, even as the weight of it settled in his chest. "I have to go to the council," he said firmly. "I need to explain everything before this spirals." Out of control. Maybe if they understand your customs, they can mediate and keep the clans from tearing each other apart. Lyra hesitated. You would stand before them for us? She asked. David gave a small, tired smile. I didn't ask for this, but it's here, and I'm not letting this turn into another war. If I can stop it by morning. David had prepared his old shuttle. The widows helped gather supplies, their quiet efficiency making it clear they understood the risks ahead. The forest around them seemed unusually still, as if holding its breath as the shuttle lifted off from the clearing, leaving behind the ruins of David's quiet life. The journey to the Terran outpost was long and silent. David sat in the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the controls, while the widows remained seated behind him, their faint glowing patterns casting soft light in the dim cabin. His mind replayed every moment since they first appeared on his doorstep, each decision pulling him further into a web of traditions, politics, and danger he never wanted, and yet he felt something strange beneath the frustration, a sense of purpose he had not felt since his years in the fleet. When they arrived at the outpost, the council delegates were already waiting, their faces unreadable as David and the 11 widows stepped down from the shuttle. The chamber they were led into was wide and cold, with metallic walls and a circular table at its center, holographic displays hovering above it showing maps of Valara Prime and surrounding systems. One of the senior Terran representatives, a tall man with sharp features, spoke first. Pilot David Arlen, your actions have drawn the attention of the Velaran clans. Explain yourself. David took a steady breath and stepped forward. I didn't do anything except save a group of civilians years ago, he said calmly. According to their traditions, that created a bond I didn't understand until these women arrived on my doorstep. They aren't here to cause trouble. They're following their customs. If we mishandle this situation, we'll light a fuse we can't put out. The council exchanged glances, murmuring quietly before the Velaran envoy spoke, his deep, resonant voice filling the chamber. These women stand under your protection, he said slowly. Our customs demand acknowledgement. If you reject them, rival clans will call them traitors, and they will be hunted. David faced him squarely. And if I acknowledge them? He asked. The envoy paused, then said simply, then the bond is fulfilled, and no one may challenge their honor. No clan will have cause to pursue them. David considered that carefully, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the chamber. One of the rival clan leaders had arrived. Unexpectedly, his obsidian armor glinting under the lights, he spoke sharply, his words laced with accusation. The human cannot claim what he does not understand. The bond is a farce. He seeks influence over our people. David clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. I don't want influence, he said firmly. I want peace. You start fighting over this, and your people will bleed. The envoy from the rival clan stepped closer, his crystalline eyes narrowing. Our honor demands it. David stared back, unflinching, and for a long, tense moment, no one in the chamber moved. Then Lyra stepped forward, her voice quiet but carrying the power that silenced the room. You speak of honor, she said, but what of survival? Our mates are gone, our homes rebuilt only because this man risked everything to save us. His people ask nothing in return, yet you would burn what remains of ours for pride. Her luminous eyes fixed on the rival envoy. If this bond is broken, we all fall. Her words seemed to ripple through the chamber like a wave, and finally the council chairperson spoke slowly and carefully. The bond is recognized by both parties, he said, which makes it valid under interspecies law. Any attempt to forcefully reclaim these women will be considered act of aggression. The rival envoy stiffened, but said nothing more. Relief washed through David, though he kept his expression calm. The council declared the bond fulfilled and recognized under Terran protection for the first time since they had appeared on his doorstep. He felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. Weeks later, back on Eridan 3, the clearing was quiet again, but it was no longer empty. David had rebuilt his cabin, this time with help from the widows, whose knowledge of Velaran materials turned it into something stronger than before. The old wooden structure was now reinforced with smooth crystalline supports and soft glowing lights woven into the walls at night. The cabin shone faintly under the moons like a beacon in the forest. David stood at the edge of the rebuilt porch, looking out across the blue grass as the soft wind carried the scent of pine. The 11 widows moved quietly around the clearing, some tending to the garden, others setting crystalline markers along the ridge. They had found purpose again, and so had he. Had wanted solitude when he came to Eridan 3. But instead he had found something unexpected, a new bond, a strange new family, and perhaps even a second chance to build something lasting. Lyra stepped beside him, silent for a long time, before finally saying softly, "Our people call you shield-bearer now." David turned to her, brow raised. "Is that a compliment?" She smiled faintly. "It means the one who protects what others cannot." David looked out across the forest, his hand resting lightly on the railing of his new home, and for the first time since leaving the fleet, he felt at peace. Maybe retirement was never meant to be quiet. Maybe it was meant to be earned. And as the 3 moons began to rise, casting silver light over the clearing, he whispered softly to himself, "Guess this is home." Now, and for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. The end.